Hello and welcome to this episode of the Moment podcast. I'm here today with Anastasios and the detective, and we're
Hello.
gonna be talking about the left-right split of the hemispheres, also symbolized by along the lines with Nietzsche's Apollonian and Dionysian as well.
Mm.
Hmm.
Which hemisphere attributes to each of the Apollonian or the Dionysian?
Well, in that sense, the Apollonian would be considered the left hemisphere, and then according to if we would go looking at like what Nietzsche would associate it with, and then the Dionysian is more right hemisphere, I would say. I don't know what your opinion on that is, the detective.
Well, yeah, I'd certainly agree with what you're saying, and this is something that McGilchrist comments on specifically in The Master and His Emissary. The left hemisphere correlates to Nietzsche's depiction of Apollo, and the right hemisphere to his depiction of Dionysus. Although, in your own video that you put out recently,
Yeah.
sort of breaking down a little bit Nietzsche's conceptions, we can see that, as you commented on, the symbolism and the psychology isn't necessarily as concrete as Nietzsche may first put across. And also, as you get further and deeper into the hemispheres, you'll also see that to say one is Apollonian and the other Dionysian, it's a useful metaphor and it's helpful to bring in some symbolism, but also it's not comprehensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the thing it's kind of like the I guess the associations really that people make regarding that, but then very much like if you look at like that kind of symbolism with Apollo or Dionysus, like it starts to pretty much fall apart, especially with like Apollo, the symbolism that he's associated with. So there is like there's a lot of nuance there that's not always that easily captured, both in the myth and in that sense, and also from what you said regarding what McGilchrist had pointed out regarding the hemispheres.
Yeah, 100%.
But yeah, with that said, I kind of do feel that, even though it might be the case, that there's more nuance there, and we can go a little bit deeper into that later, I do feel still that people still internally associated with those things, and not just that, but also I do feel like that that kind of, I guess the kind of thinking has like an influence still on people, and you can kind of still see it somewhat reflected and in society to a degree. But then also, if we take it back to what you had commented regarding Romanticism and the kind of like quote unquote Enlightenment ideas, that there's also something playing out there too, like why Nietzsche might have associated it with these kind of ideas, even though the one looks at the mythology, it doesn't really hold up as neatly.
Yeah, I'd definitely say so. On the Enlightenment and Romanticism split, it's interesting to look at because there are differing perspectives. So, for example, in McGilchrist's own work, he looks at the Enlightenment as a loss of the right hemisphere and a promotion to like a deleterious degree of the left hemisphere. And then following on from that is the Romantic Revolution, wherein the right hemisphere is supposedly in its proper place as the master, although there is more nuance to that as well that we could break down, and more critical perceptions. So, for example, there's a lot that goes into it and a lot leading into it, but as something to grasp a hold of, to enter into the history, we could sort of think of the Cartesian split, wherein as a result of his philosophy, we sort of get a hardcore solipsism, subjectivism, and also on the other side, empiricism, positivism, and a reliance on the mathematical and a rejection of the sense data. And so in that, there's your split of Apollo and Dionysius in a quite a liberal sense. And then we see that manifested in the Enlightenment and the Romantic periods.
Yeah, and you know the thing is that it's both with Nietzsche, but you know with this also regarding, you know, our own current situation, important to keep this kind of this kind of context in mind, because very much, you know, because I know from, you know, going further back into history with it's kind of like where this kind of started, and more in the Middle Ages already, like, you know, because it's been like building up for a long time. I don't know, like it's just that it's just important to understand that, to be able to also see like kind of like how did we get here in the first place.
Yeah, definitely, because we are very much still wrestling with this Cartesian split. And I say it's Cartesian, but really there's a lot more that goes into it. And you can, like you've alluded to, you can trace it further back in history. But this is sort of the heritage we've been left with and are currently dealing with. And there are some progressions forward. So you can look at from Descartes onwards throughout the Enlightenment and Romantic periods. Most of the philosophers in some capacity will take up this challenge that Descartes has left us with. So Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and of course Nietzsche. And realistically, although plenty, like all the philosophers come to their own culmination to the problem, but it's quite clear looking at the challenges of modernity that we haven't truly solved this problem. Although, there are developing perspectives. I'd say around something that bears fruit, in my perception at least, is sort of a re-evaluation of the conflict between top-down and bottom-up processing, to put it in some cognitive science language. So rather than just trying to keep these forces at odds, like the Romantic and the Enlightenment, or Apollo and Dionysius, what's now appearing to be the better option is to reintegrate, the integration.
Yeah. I don't know, from the folklore and, you know, mythology that I've looked into in the past, especially regarding to the myths regarding King Arthur and the Holy Grail, but also regarding Merlin. There's a particular myth also that starts to pop up at a certain around a certain time within history, where there's a slow shift going on within the churches as well, where they're shifting slowly towards trying to get to a rational Christian society, where the folklore Merlin figure gets slowly more like demonic, slowly more like there's this shift, and eventually there's the story of the tower where he gets locked up in the tower, and he either dies or something happens to him, or it's just kind of like unsure what's going on. But they're in that sense, from a Jungian lens, Merlin really being seen as like this wise old man kind of figure, and with it linking to the self, and kind of in a way also linking to the more like I guess like plurality of myth that there used to be, regarding all of these different folklore traditions and these different traditions that used to be there. And it kind of like, in my opinion, kind of started there at that point, which was around like 1100 to 1300, roughly, give or take.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd say it's sort of around similar times where we start to see the theological philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas trying to grapple with this issue. In large degree, like the emergence of the scientific method, and like you said, this more rational outlook. And in many ways, the religious institutions were increasingly backed into a corner, hence the philosophers such as Aquinas or William of Ockham, who were sort of dancing around ways in which they perhaps could integrate the two. Although, if we look at history in a holistic sense, what it appears more as what has happened is that just more and more pieces of the religious institutions have been cut off and culminated in a severing from the whole axial heritage, and hence we lose like modes of being such as the participatory and ritual and tradition and community, and which lands us in this Cartesian split of body and mind, in which we get the enlightened empiricists or the irrationalist romantics, like we've talked about.
But yeah, the thing is though that this split still has definitely also its effects right now too in the culture as well. And we can see this in, I think, in many ways. Maybe like in kind of like a splits in different manners. Can see it maybe politically, but also in a more like masculine, feminine sense, but also kind of like intellect, kind of instinct kind of sense too, like instinct, emotion.
Yeah, sure. And this is why the Apollonian and Dionysian split does still have some utility. And the political example is a good one, because that sort of is essentially birthed out during the French Revolution, which is, according to thinkers such as Nietzsche, is very much a Dionysian phenomena. And it comes out of the Romantic period, of course.
Yeah, which in that sense symbolically also makes a lot of sense. But then at the same time, from what I remembered, I think there was a cult of reason at the time of the French Revolution, but then eventually some deism cult took place. But then, eventually it was Napoleon who reestablished the Catholic Church again after they were like, not in the best relations with the French people at the time. But but also do think like, even though I don't know that we have like this, I guess, inheritance from that, I do also feel that some part of the answer also lies further back into the past, in that sense too, because I mean, at some point we did not have this particular split or this particular issue, even though like things were different back then, and there's things we know now, but at the same time there's got to be like a solution for it, because it's like partly like, yes, it has implications for many things in society, like science and how we kind of like conduct our society to some degree as well. But then I do also feel like at the same time it's this way that we view things also relates to ourselves as like a person as well, our own being, and how we kind of like relate to the different parts of ourselves as well.
Yeah, certainly. This the split that we are talking about and hopefully trying to heal is very much mirrored within the individual as much as it's present in culture, I would say.
Yeah. And I would kind of just add also from a Jungian lens, like looking at Dionysius and Apollo. In some sense, they are also, they are archetypal figures, and people have their associations with these figures as well. And generally, like there are, because of the preceding things within the culture and in history itself too, there is this I guess it's a kind of like a newer Jungian thing. It's called like cultural complexes. It's basically complexes that's like the patterns of behavior and thoughts and feelings that are like generally considered personal, but then they've taken it to a cultural level where these are more like, in a way, they're like cultural memes in a way, where these cultural memes are passed through, not just not just in like a very local sense of within a particular community, but it becomes like a wider phenomena, and those kind of like complexes that are linked to two ideas also govern a lot of these behaviors, and also like how we see these archetypal figures and how we relate to these things as well. And in that sense, from a Jungian lens, then one would really wonder, then like maybe to some degree, at least, and that would be more probably more personal. It would be helpful to create like a different kind of relationship with those kind of figures, and these symbolic figures, and to, I guess, in that way understand them better, to get a more nuanced picture of what it means. But then again, also, that kind of boils down to, in its own way, just to find one's own relationship with these different parts within oneself, and through that also outside of oneself too. And that kind of then boils down to, I would say, individuation.
Yeah, as the goal. And we could even, to bring back in the hemispheres, we could link that very much to what you said, because, of course, we can understand the hemispheres in this scientific lens, but at the same time, everyone has, well, on average, shall we say, people own their own pair of hemispheres and have to deal with their own balance. Whilst we're looking at society, and we can say, well, is civilization currently sort of tilting to the left, and how might we bring it back into a proper balance and sort of rejuvenate the right? It's very much, like you've alluded to, a process of individuation, because the hemispheres are housed within the individual.
Yeah, and in that sense, that kind of that kind of balancing very much would then also require one to balance that within oneself, and that really, and also means to, I guess, in some sense, with could call it shadow work, really, and from a Jungian lens, to bring particular things into consciousness regarding anything that's been repressed, or is there regarding how one views particular things. But then at the same time, I do also feel that, I don't know, there is also just a real need, I feel, to recreate something within the culture that would facilitate this kind of process of individuation itself as well.
Yeah, to pick up on the shadow work, I think the hemisphere idea could very much be brought into that, because like in a similar way to the archetypes, we always have the brain is always within ourselves, and this is something that McGilchrist points out, is that however much we may lose touch with that right hemisphere aspect of the world, it is always within our reach to regain that and rebalance that, which is, very much like the idea of shadow work. And of course, we know that shadow work doesn't mean it's not all bad traits that get repressed into the shadow. It's any part of the psyche that happens to be repressed. And then on the cultural aspect, the culture in itself, just like the broad idea of community, is increasingly something that's missing. And, in different ways, more and more people are sort of being sucked up into this digital exodus and falling into a sense of narcissism, just regressing within themselves. And, there's a lot that goes into that. And we could say, for example, we're in a novel position in the sense that it's entirely possible to just stay within your own home. You can work from home. You can have everything you could ever desire delivered straight to your own home. And so being in this novel position, we've sort of been thrown here without the wisdom to know, well, how do we now navigate having everything we want at our disposal? People now have to go out of their way to socialize and come to community, whereas when resources were more scarce and everything was more troublesome, say for example something as simple as cooking a meal, if you're cooking on a fire and using ingredients, it's necessary that the entire meal will be prepared at one time, and so everyone within the community must come together to eat at the same time, whereas now, you know, any individual can eat whenever they want. And so if we want to bring back that communal meal time, people actually have to organize it and go out of the way. And if anything, it's less convenient. And this is tying into, like how I say, we've been thrown into this position without the wisdom to navigate it, because as we are now being forced to recognize, there's plenty of wisdom in community and a lot that we as individuals lose without that community. So yeah, I definitely agree. Like just bringing back community in the most general sense, and then on top of that, if we can build a community that is wise to these philosophical ramifications and psychological aspects, that's all the better. And hopefully, in some capacity, we're facilitating this, you know, through, you know, trying to look on the bright side of social media and things like the internet and YouTube. And of course, there's plenty others on a similar path.
Yeah.
Also, it's very interesting.
Anastasios, you're breaking up.
Wait a bit.
Okay.
I will try to. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yes, like from me, from what I get, also like with the Temple of Reason that they made during the French Revolution, like that Rousseau and the other people of Enlightenment, and I think they are called encyclopedists, something like this, the people of encyclopedia, that they wanted to reach a high stasis of reason, arts, intellect, and humanism. In a sense, also being polymaths, that was a very Apollonian inspired path that they took. And there is also the Romanticism part that, yes, it is Dionysian. And unfortunately, you don't have the hunger for this, like for human evolution, so much in today's world. Mostly, I think the seclusion comes from self-alienation, and self-alienation induces, and the alienation from society induces self-alienation as well. And to a point, it has to do with the part that we don't try to challenge ourselves according to the Apollonian, like to go higher mathematic. Like even the Fibonacci sequence is Apollonian in a sense. The creation of universe by higher geometry is a kind of Apollonian. Apollonian. This geometry needs a different kind of eyes and a different kind of scope to be able to fetch it. And also Dionysian, you could say, is the power to be present in a sense. Like always in my mind, the Dionysian drive reminds me of the eagle. When the eagles become very, very old, there is a saying in our tradition that the eagle starts to lose his heart, like his heartbeat becomes very slow, and he's going to drop, to die at one point because his heart is failing. The only way to get his heart pumping fast again and be lively is to take a drop, to take a very deep dive and at the last point when his life drive kicks back in face of death, he turns up again towards the sky. As he lets himself to dive down, he almost gets to the ground and flies up again. This is a risky thing that the eagle does, but by flirting with death, he denies it and affirms life stronger. And I think this is also the kick of the Dionysian drive. And we lack a lot in our society because we are not exposed to the reality of life, like to danger, to having to be alone sometimes, to be nervous, to have to go through a difficult situation. For example, in our world today, there are no wars. We haven't experienced famine. We haven't seen most of the time situations happy and sad and in a communal sense. And outside, many times, many of the things we are experiencing are through a screen. So this is the lack of the Dionysian, I think, in our today's society. Like there is not so much this livelihood, this in touch with the situations in life, that every little thing is meaningful and the feeling we have towards it. And the Apollonian is the mediocrity of today's world. That we try to find countermeasures that emulate life, but we don't face the difficulties of life directly. Like from mending a situation, it can be politically, like to try to improvise. What are you going to do? What are you going to do in this situation? To fix something that is broken in home on your own. To find a plan to deal with a difficult situation in work. Many times we feel stuck. This overcoming the riddle, overcoming the stuckness by outcunning it and by solving it also in a mathematical way, I think this is the Apollonian drive. So the Muses are the followers of Apollo, and the Menads, are the followers of Dionysus in this way.
That is indeed correct. Then again, to bring up an example from myth, if you go, further back, actually, to ancient Greece, regarding, let's say, Apollo, for instance. He had, for instance, with the muse Thalia, together offspring that were the Corybantes, that were actually considered ecstatic dancers, that were actually also connected to Dionysus. So, once you really dive into these kind of myths, and also, well, especially if you go into the Orphic mystery schools, then things become a little nuanced and a little more, interesting in that sense.
Also, Corybantes, in a sense, they are a depiction of Corios.
Yeah.
Also, the root most possibly is the origin for also Carians, and Corvus, the word for son or young boy, that is the root for Corios as well.
Yes.
And the young warrior in a sense. And they were the ones who trained Zeus in the story and were protecting Zeus by hitting their shields. Some stories say they are titans. Some stories say they are people from the golden or even the bronze race in Hesiod's Day and the Works, that it has the 4 races of humans, the 5 actually, if you add also the race of heroes. And it is very interesting that as you go back, like very, very, very back into like mythology and also even to Greek art, the two types of songs are Pean and Dithyrambos. Dithyrambos is the type of poetry that you use for Dionysus and for Dionysos, and it means from two doors, from two ways, and dancing like in a circular dance that cuts through each other. It is a communal dancing in a sense, and it is mostly warrior dances. A lot of the Dithyrambi were sung by Spartans. Like Spartans had a lot of Pindar and so on. And Pean is an older deity before it got mixed with Apollo. Apollo appears as a solar deity. There is a similar solar deity in Hittite mythology and so on. And he is a god of disease. And he reminds me a lot being struck by cancer, like the dark side of the sun is something that is hateful towards humans and towards people who challenge it. That's why Apollo becomes reclusive. You don't see Apollo a lot being around people and being jolly. Many times you see he punishes people in very harsh ways. He also is jealous of his sibling, Artemis. Like when Artemis finds Orion, even this, he doesn't let her to have her love. And you see many instances like this. Dionysos, there is a feeling because he is a dying and coming up again deity, and also he is a type of the golden child archetype, maybe a rightful heir type of golden child, whereas Apollo became more like a spoiled child. He took a different direction. And yes, like Dionysos all the time goes near the people, like he goes to find a company, he travels. He does also bad acts and drives people crazy and such. But and also both of them, they try to force their way onto people. But it is in a different sense. It's like because Dionysus in one of the last myths, when his body was eaten by the giants and Athena placed his heart into a mannequin body, it is like Dionysus indulges in all of this in order to feel, like make his artificial body not only a lens, but a conductor between his heart and the outside. Whereas Apollo, you see coming at odds with the world, like coming with a sharp point to the world. He strengthens, he empowers himself, and he overcomes the obstacles. But at the same time, he becomes more secluded internally from the outside. And also, Detective brought the example of Narcissus before, that Narcissus and Apollo are very, very, very connected.
There's a lot in that I'd like to pick up on. So, to even just take it back for a moment to the French Revolution, too. I mean, I very much agree with what was said on that. McGilchrist brings up the point that their values the French Revolution is built upon, though it comes out of the Romantic period, they are very much Enlightenment values. Liberty, of course, being a prime example. And yet still we see Nietzsche and also Jung, to a degree, comment on how really it's the Dionysian energies that cause these great outbursts of bloody revolutions and wars. So we could think of it as Apollonian, left hemispheric, and Enlightenment philosophies that are running on a Dionysian energy that lead to these great catastrophes. And so I suppose, because Nietzsche says Apollo and Dionysus come together in the tragedy, and so reality in that sense, perhaps it really does mirror the artistic when we get these great and huge catastrophic calamities, when we have the dangerous sides of each of these forces coming together, the unbridled Dionysian and the overly abstract Apollonian Enlightenment. And also I very much liked the comments about how the lack of danger the average person faces today is actually paradoxically becoming only worse. It's like a positive feedback loop leading us into a worse and worse situation in which we're only backing away further and further from reality. And McGilchrist comments directly that it is sort of a unique position in today's world where the weaknesses of the left hemisphere are allowed to flourish in such a way, because even at the time of the Enlightenment, a time characterized by the left hemisphere, ultimately the challenges of the day would beat people to a degree into realizing aspects of the right hemisphere and, the sensory, instinctual aspect of reality. Whereas today, like we've talked about briefly, we are in such a comfortable position that the left hemisphere can completely believe its own BS. And linking to that similarly is this Apollonian idea mentioned about solving reality. It's 100% a characteristic of the Enlightenment period. This idea that all of our questions can be answered if only asked in the proper way, and thus reality can be controlled and completely navigated through this propositional frame of knowledge. Whereas what is ultimately lost in this, and the Romantics rediscovered at least to an extent, is this the betweenness, the integration, the intuitive, and the mysteriousness of reality, the no-thingness, the withdrawal into the infinite expanse where the old is always renewed and reality is always in this becoming, evolving process. And similarly, to bring back this idea of integration and talking about opposition and the mutually supporting, when integrated, Apollo and Dionysus, just like the yin yang, there's an aspect, there's a blot of the white in the black and the black in the white, just as good nor evil, if we want to characterize such ideas in such a way. There's nothing so good that it is pure, and that if we could only get more and more of such a thing, it would always remain beneficial. And there is nothing so evil that, if not properly integrated, wouldn't have some salutary effect. And just one last thing that I thought was really interesting, because something I'm not entirely familiar with, was this idea, the connection between the golden child and the spoiled child, because I think this, in a way, very much characterizes our current state in an archetypal way, in the sense that we are ostensibly the most prosperous society that there has ever been. We have everything we want at our fingertips. And so one would imagine that the children born into this society would be only carrying on that legacy, bridging us to new heights that could only have been imagined hitherto. And yet, what has actually happened is this devolvement into narcissism and an incapability to deal with the excesses of these dopaminergic forces, just endless scrolling on TikTok and endless consumption of junk food and junk ideas.
In a way, I kind of think regarding this too, though, with with Apollo and Dionysius, and also in that sense, what kind of is going on. In a way, I would say it is very much this, because we've been talking about that there is not enough of that Dionysian life force there, but if it's not integrated, it still kind of has a life on its own. And I kind of feel with the French Revolution, even though it was driven on these Enlightenment values, it's when something isn't integrated that, when it's in the shadow, when it's unconscious, that it can have its own influence and drive upon things that isn't completely conscious, which can lead to very bad outcomes. And I do think that there for sure is an interplay there regarding this, and in that sense, the Dionysian. If I think about that in the sense of the Orphic mysteries, for instance, what you can see there, very much from a Jungian lens, also regarding these mysteries, is the integration of the more primal aspects as well. For instance, Apollodorus, for instance, had pointed out too, regarding how first humans are more like the Titans until they become more like Bacchus, so more so have their how I put it, in the beginning, reason is cut up by basically by what boils down to instinct, or unintegrated instinct, where it has to be basically brought into consciousness and to kind of untangled from each other. So there's some sense of harmony internally between these two forces. And then the Orphic mysteries, from what I know, what I just want to point out, there's also generally a feminine figure also involved that needs to be internalized within these mysteries. From a Jungian lens, I would really, think about an anima figure in this sense, or, for women, that would be an animus figure, that would in that sense, be helpful in balancing these two to, bring that connection between consciousness and the unconscious, and with it to these different forces. But go ahead, Anastasios.
Also, it is very interesting how Dionysos and Apollon, they both had originally some other aspect that were considered higher in archaic or even early Bronze Age eras. For example, the first Dionysos, even his name brings it as such. It means the son of Zeus. And in the very original form, when Zeus had a partner with similar etymology, Zeus and Dion,
Yes.
in older form, it could be something like Diaos, and Diauna. This might be the original form, or Diaun. They were sky deities, both of them, and they had a son that was Dionysos. This first son, he is also called Iacchos. There are three Dionysi, in a sense. The
Yes.
first one is a conqueror. He is a legitimate son of Zeus. He is also a thunderer. He is depicted as red-haired, and he is what Alexander the Great aspired to be. Like at one point, there were Dionysiaca, a type of epic that it is not completely saved in our days. Even in the Roman time, it wasn't exactly intact. And then you have the second Dionysos, that it is Zagreus. This one is more Zagros is a mountain in a mountain range in Persia, and it is near where the wine culture came to be between ancient Armenia, Persia, and not Andronovo culture, I would say near the cradle of the makeup culture, where even the world wine comes to be. And it is, he is connected very much with the wine making. He is a dying and a rising deity. Maybe what Iacchos was said as a prophecy of a rightful heir, and also he means the screamer, like he is the intense power towards the sky. Zagreus is mostly of a dying and rising up again deity. It is not certain if Zagreus was consumed by the giants when they were trying to take revenge on Zeus, or if Zagreus, or it is the third Dionysos, the son of Semele. Also, there is a possibility that Zagreus had different parents, the queen and the king of the underworld.
Yes.
Zeus and Zeus of Melichios Zeus, he is called. He is an underworld deity symbolized as a big golden snake, and having secret wisdom, but also he's a chaos destruction god of the underworld. And there is an earth mother figure that also is an underworld figure. In the Greek myth, she equals to Persephone, or Demeter also as a recycler of life. And so you have this underworld being coming around, depending of it if it is a rise or fall of the weather. If it is winter, he dies, and he rises up again in the summer. So you start to have this image mostly, yes, in these times. And there is a possibility that Dionysos is a reincarnation of the previous one. And the third one is the son of Semele, that was born from a mortal. He is incubated into the thigh of his father as his mother dies, and he is stillborn. And he, or the second one again, he dies eaten by the giants, while he is protected by Corybantes in the same cave that Zeus was born in. He died, and also in the same fashion that Zeus was raised, but his inheritance, in a sense, following the same path that Zeus followed, is being hindered by the giant's revenge. And that's why he's being consumed and only his heart remains. And they make, with the help of Hephaestus, a new body to shelter his heart and for him to keep living. That's why he indulges so much in wine and to extreme behaviors and so on, because he is not completely in direct touch with the world.
Interesting. It's very interesting, because if you look at the Orphic mysteries, and I know that they've been shifting around Hesiod's theogony a lot. They kind of shifted it to the point where Zagreus is the for them the firstborn, then Dionysus is the secondborn, and then they go back to Iacchus as the thirdborn. So that's rather the other way, basically almost the other way around.
Yes, Orphics have a very, very ancient knowledge, and they try to bring together Eastern kind of mythology, philosophy, and even shamanistic kinds of approaches together with a very, very archaic Greek mythology. This mythology, for example, was not known by the major populace during the Hellenistic era, for example.
Yeah, because for them, it started with Dionysus Zagreus as the firstborn, and then and then the story of Dionysus and Semele was where, according to him, according to the Orphics, he descends into the underworld to face Zagreus, where after he did that, either that or rescuing his mom, depending on the version, he ascends as Iacchus again, and then he ascends to Olympus, according to them. It's almost like a trying to get back to that original, I guess, version that Alexander then was striving to be, in that sense.
Exactly, and this is also maybe one of the reasons Alexander tried to show that he is an inheritor of Ammon Zeus or the horned Ammon and so on, like in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
He tried to assume Iacchus' role.
Which makes a lot of sense.
Yes, to be this divine emanation, this sky god being peerless over earth, and like also a ruler of the land, but also a sky father figure.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to go this path.
Yeah, and then just the interesting thing regarding, these things is that it paints a whole different picture of Dionysus, and from what I know, regarding what's happening, for instance, in Arcadia and also in Athens, if I'm not mistaken, with Apollo, there's also what is considered to be Wolf Apollo as well, which is like a different figure entirely too. Which some of them have, from what I know, have tried to link it to the choreos.
Yes, Apollo is connected with ravens and wolves and chariots. And also he is connected with singing to the birds. They both have right and left brain instances, but I think the depiction is very good, like to divide the obscure and the subtle and put it in the right brain, and in the left brain to put the more structured and processing kind of activity. Also, Apollo and Dionysus, they are connected to Hermes, that
That's
has
true.
elements of both.
Yeah, and then in a more ancient sense, though, Hermes kind of goes back to, if I'm not mistaken, to Pan as well, in a more archaic sense. But that aside.
Exactly, exactly. And maybe Hermes is a mix of Pan together with some earlier version of an Indo-European Apollo that was like a great warrior and a sun worshipper, or even a sun deity that was like a warlord. And this got absorbed later in period by the Apollonian figure, the disease god of the sun, and mixed with Pean, the Hyborian singer and healer, also the one that taught Asclepius the medicine. And later, by assuming his role as Apollo and driving the sun, little by driving the fettered Titan with his chariot, he assumed also a role similar to Helios,
Yeah.
the solar deity, who is the sun incarnate.
Yeah. But what I can say though from that regarding these figures, it does kind of become like clear that indeed they are much more nuanced than I guess most people know, and I do think it boils down to what you said, the detective, regarding this yin and yang idea of that they kind of like contain, like the essence of the other at the same time, and at the same time also I do think looking at these different things such as the mystery schools, the Corybantes, a lot of these different types of rituals from the past. From a Jungian lens, a lot of this, boils down again to shadow work, boils down again to this sense of individuation, to really to reconcile both again, and I do think in that sense, it does boil down to that, and then it kind of also at the same time, in a personal sense, I would say, yeah, it does also boil down to a sense of community again too, because I kind of feel like that's part of a lot of these things too, because they didn't do these things alone, they did it together, and it's as much an important aspect of it, of these things as well. And when looking at a lot of these older rituals, especially going, further back in time, think like going all the way back to like the choreos and that those kind of rituals. These were done in a group and were initiation rituals, and they were a type of rite of passage, which was done at quite a young age, really, if you think about it. And the thing is, those kind of rituals and what they went through, because they were outside of the society when they were going through these things, is something that would also be at the same time the sense of bonding experience as well. And in that sense, I do feel that it is something that is very much in that sense missing.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up there. So
yeah,
I'd say I'm certainly not as well educated on all this mythology stuff, so it's super interesting to hear about, and it's also stimulating ideas within myself. And so if I may tie this back to the culture, I would say definitely I do agree that we are in a time characterized by an imbalance towards the left hemisphere and Apollonian spirits, but at the same time, especially taking into account the unconscious, perhaps we could also characterize our time more than anything as a depiction wherein it's the worst of each of the forces, the manifestation of the worst aspects of each of the forces, which is characterizing our time. So we have this poorly integrated instinctual Dionysian, wherein the extreme examples come forward, such as Nietzsche's analysis of the revolution, or Jung prefers Wotan to Dionysus as his example when he talks about the world wars.
Yes.
But also in more domestic examples, this inability for people to control their appetites and becoming slaves to their own dopaminergic systems. All this links to unconscious content, wherein if we want to talk about the archetypes, it's as if they are running around in this poor, unintegrated fashion, and thus, like, the average individual appears as a slave to the worst whims of said archetype. And this brings in the idea of what is the role of the individual, the consciousness and the individuation process. And so we can think about, in our modern context, two key things come to mind, for me at least, which is that we are seeing, in opposition to this this functional idea of consciousness, to bring in some Eric Neumann terminology, we're seeing a sort of uroboric incest on quite a mass scale. And specifically what I'm referring to in this is the aspect of this regression toward the internet in particular, which is something we've sort of discussed before, and I've talked about it on my channel, about how the internet sort of takes on this role of the devouring mother. And so the relationship a person may find in that is sort of characteristic of this idea of uroboric incest, which Neumann talks about. And then also at the same time, something I've been increasingly picking up on and bringing forward on my channel is this idea, sort of in a broad sense, we could say consciousness failing, which we see again in that uroboric incest idea, but also to tie in this archetypal idea of the hero and the hero's journey. This is somewhat representative of a functional role of consciousness and what it does. And so we're seeing the failure of the consciousness and the hero. And an example that you just brought up was this leaving behind of the initiation ritual, which has some ties, but also in a broader sense, something, it's as if the hero's journey is still taking place but we could think of it as, rather than integrating the unknown back into the known world, it's more akin to the hero just continuously relives this cycle. And to bring in another idea, we could also frame it as the hero never grows up into the warrior, if you want to use that archetype.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this, like, people literally aren't growing up, in a sense. You know, people these days, they stay in the education system for longer than ever. And just cultural things like there's a skill sets that people are missing out on. And then even in the media, there is this heroic obsession. And it, like, to talk about the specifics of the media, there's sort of like a meme in superhero media wherein no one really ever dies and no story is really ever finished because the character has always just come back. And so we're seeing this playing out, this idea where the hero's journey is never fully completed. It's just completely replaying, and the hero never grows up. In these two sides, you know, just to name those two, this media representation and also embodied in real life situation. And so I would like to just throw this out there as an idea, connect this to our modern situation in which we're sort of coming off the back of where the two worlds mythology, the axial revolution, wherein that was the dominant system for a long time, where there is this ordinary world, and you know, this is taken up specifically by different religious, mythological, and theological institutions, wherein we have this clearly defined, or should I say, the world of everyday experience, the normal world, but also this higher transcendent world, which we can try to achieve. That's what the hero tries to achieve in their journeys, trying to build their way toward that. It's and our current situation is sort of that we've lost that in the mythology, and also scientifically. And when I say we've lost that, I'm talking about, you know, we see this spiritually. We can analyze the meaninglessness experienced by people as the missing, like, this is the missing piece people are missing. And it's also seen in the decline of Christianity, which is just one example of a religion where this two worlds mythology is a key component. And so, and also, like, in things like memes, I'd say it's a meme where, you know, these flat earthers, that's like an example of how the world has become flat in a literal sense for those people, and that mimetic perception, and which is reflective of this flattened ontology. And also, even to bring back Nietzsche, he sort of takes up this idea in his idea of eternal return, which is sort of a nostalgic mythological idea. So, like, in the wake of the collapse of this two worlds mythology, he, as many others have done, have sort of regressed towards an earlier idea of a flat ontology where reality is cyclical and sort of follows periods, like a continuous reliving of a cyclical reality. And this links, of course, to the crisis of meaning, because we are not suited to live in that flat world, and we also can no longer rely on this two world mythology. And so the hero fails, and in a very broad sense, we don't know how then to balance things like the Apollonian and Dionysian, the two hemispheres, and our intellect and instincts. So I'd be very interested to hear if you have any thoughts on that, about how the two worlds mythology has collapsed, and, the fallout of that, the dangers of that, and how possibly we may think about moving forward from that.
Well, one first thing that came to mind, when you were talking about the hero archetype, and the hero archetype not dying, I just wanted to just bring up that in older stories, a lot of the times, this death that happens in mythologies, there's a lot of like death and rebirth symbolism as well, which is key in the hero's journey as well. And if that doesn't happen, like you said, they remain kind of childlike. And from what I know regarding this, this kind of death and rebirth ritual, what it really does is, to try to connect to the deeper levels and the collective unconscious, so the archetypes, and and with these rituals, I mean like these different rituals, like the Chorus rituals or other similar rituals as well that exist. Another one would be, for instance, with Artemis, with the Arctea, for instance. But yeah, so regarding this, regarding the dangers of this collapse, I don't know, like if we don't have this two world system anymore. But the thing is, we also don't really have, and we can't really go back to the old way either. Not entirely. It's like, yes, we can learn from the past, but we can't go back to it either. But I would also say that kind of idea of eternal recurrence, to some degree, there is something to it in like the more like animistic sense of like, well, there's the seasons, there's particular cycles that happen within nature. There's particular, I guess, cycles that tend to happen within civilizations as well. But then at the same time, it's kind of like, I don't know, maybe in a way it's also kind of at the same time kind of the death of a lot of these ideas that existed too, regarding this sense of like linear progression, this linear kind of thinking, focused on things such as growth and these kind of ideas. The thing is that I don't think we have to go through, like an eternal recurrence in that sense. In a way, we are kind of are, because individuation is kind of like that, and life is kind of like that in a way too. But at the same time, there also needs to be, I do feel like a striving there to try to, I guess you can say it in a way, maybe wrestle with it in some sense. It's not really wrestle, it's more like dance with it, maybe is a better way how to put it, like to know how to go up and to go down with the kind of the movements of the cycle in some sense. But also, I do feel like coming out of the worldview that we do and is failing, it's probably gonna be for quite a while a period of time where we're gonna be in between whatever is going to come next. Because the thing is that I do believe that there's something gonna come out of it, because in the end, I don't know, maybe I'm very optimistic, but like I do believe that the human spirit can find its way back, and can find a way to balance it in a way where it's both. Yes, there's these cycles, but we can also learn from it. So it doesn't have to. Maybe in the end, it doesn't have to be exactly the same cycle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I really like that. I found it really interesting. A lot of good ideas. The idea of thinking of it as a dance, I really like that. I think there could be a lot in that. Of course, these are still just new developing ideas. Like you said, I certainly agree. We are in this in between period, and we could well be here for a long time. I do agree. I don't think it's overly optimistic to say that humanity may well land in a more amenable position. Because McGilchrist talks about how there are phases in which what he considers to be the right alignment, wherein the right hemisphere is the master. There's periods in time where supposedly we are in the right balance. Now, to that, you could always say, well, the balance may well be in place for a time, but if the balance can't sustain itself, then clearly that's whatever those periods represent, it's not the final solution. And we could quite simply give up on this idea of final solution. Any sort of utopic notions wherein we'll reach the final balance and that we'll be able to call it a day. If anything, we're not trying to find the final balance. We are trying to just how can I explain it? Embody the balancing process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's kind of what I started to figure too, regarding a lot of the research that I've been doing. A while ago, this video that I did regarding the cycles of civilizations too. From what I can see, it just, in a lot of ancient civilizations, in the beginning they had like their kind of, you could call them like revitalization rituals. It's basically rite of passage kind of rituals, and I would really call them like individuation rituals in some sense. And at some point, civilizations tend to forget these things, and then things start to go downhill. But it's these kind of rituals. It's these kind of like continual kind of like death and rebirths that happen on a small scale that then end up preventing a larger fiasco to happen. It's kind of like a voluntary kind of, in a way, I kind of would say it's kind of like a voluntary kind of process of burning away the dead wood, so it doesn't get to the point where it's basically like you end up like a dry forest, and then just a single match sets the whole thing ablaze. It's like you make sure that the forest renews itself continuously, so then it doesn't get to the point where much would happen to it. But the thing is, the forest drying out, and the sense of vitality then going away I do think boils again, like, yeah, to this like Dionysian energy in an integrated manner as well. And I do think, partly in like some of those older warrior traditions, especially, well, kind of like linked to Apollo in some sense, with these particular warrior traditions, but also different traditions and different cultures and kind of different ways of like trying to integrate the Dionysian, which they did with the Orphic mysteries, for instance, as well, is kind of key in it. But also the thing is that these kind of rituals, a lot of these kind of rituals that were done in either a yearly manner or like every 4 years, and in an old sense, in an ancient pagan kind of sense, they understood this need for continual renewal. And I do kind of feel, though, that maybe that's one of the things that started to be really lost, because the Romans, for instance, at some point lost a lot of these kind of type of rituals themselves, and that kind of connection to nature more as well, which is kind of like a natural development of like what happens in civilizations, really. But what's kind of also thinking like from a spiritual lens, and that might be something to say, but it is kind of partly true. In the old sense, there used to be kind of like this idea of this continuous cycle of death and rebirth, and like kind of like a idea of sacrifices, oftentimes also connected to this. But there was this continuous kind of like death and rebirth that happened. But at this point in time, it really like makes me wonder also regarding this kind of kind of like the, I guess maybe a Christian or modern kind of like view on things, if such a thing does still occur as much in society at large. And I don't think it really does. This kind of like this death and rebirth kind of side of life, this process of facing that, and kind of like realigning with that sense of I guess you could call it truth in a way. So society doesn't end up to it doesn't end up like a dry forest, and it can like rejuvenate itself.
Yeah, I thought that great use of metaphor, and there was a lot of deep wisdom in that. A lot I'd agree with, and these ideas of, I'd say, to pick up on the loss of the death and rebirth. I think possibly we could tie this to this cultural narcissism we've got going on, and the excess of Apollonian in the Nietzschean sense, in the Birth of Tragedy, where he talks about individuation as this Apollonian spirit. Obviously this is different to how Jung uses it.
Yeah.
In this context, it's quite opposed to this idea of death and rebirth that you've brought forth, because the individuation, similarly in a Schopenhauerian sense, is essentially the willful, like the ego's willful imposition upon reality.
Yeah.
Like this innate sort of basic drive towards life and to differentiate and be an individual, and refuse what Nietzsche would call this Dionysian, like ecstatic, ritualistic return to a more communal sense, the momentary loss of the sense of self. And, as Nietzsche progresses in his work, certainly this idea of Apollonian and Dionysian, it sort of becomes muddied and lost. And it's unclear as to what he might say in his later years on this specifically. But just to take up this idea, we've linked Apollo to the left hemisphere. We know we're a more left hemispheric centric society, and this links to these ideas of individuation and to a narcissistic degree, and in a narcissistic sense, this egoic sense of self, and also the way in which we majoritatively perceive reality currently, this championing and the remnants of the enlightened values relating to the propositional sense of knowing, this just intellectual abstract knowledge. You can see how this would connect with this idea of Apollonian individuation, wherein the ego is a very crystallized and hard construct, and the sense of self would refuse this idea of death and rebirth because it's so narcissistically connected to itself. And like McGilchrist talks about the over optimism of the left hemisphere, the incapability to see its own weaknesses. It's like culturally and collectively we've lost this ability to see the dead wood you were talking about. And so we've lost the death and rebirth. It's like I'd say it's even so far as not only have we lost any ritual tied to that, it's like a lost sense entirely, because this egoic, narcissistic perception so many people are sucked up into. And I'm not saying this in an accusatory manner. I'm more so alluding to the idea that it's so culturally embedded. We could think of it as like the archetype it's embodied its own existence, and the people are just at the whims of the archetype. And we need to think about, in that symbolic sense, how are we going to free ourselves from this like Cthulhu monster who's like entrenched us in this situation in which we are like, on behalf of this archetype, the minions who are self-destructing due to our own narcissism and egoic perception, lacking the ritual of the death and rebirth, incapable of seeing the dead wood that is actually dragging us down.
I don't know. It kind of also brings to mind, because you happened to mention Cthulhu. This one, it's quite a while ago that I looked into it, but it was regarding the Kraken, actually, and that kind of symbolism. And from what I've know regarding that from both mythology, but also kind of the symbolism. Symbolically, the Kraken within the culture tends to come up a lot before either like a social or like a kind of like war kind of sense of conflict or tension going on, and I've in that sense linked it to the collective shadow in some sense, in the sense of like an integrated instinct, kind of like how I generally see it. And I think that's kind of like part of it, and that's kind of also part of the collective shadow in a way too, because there's like the personal shadow, yes, but there's the collective shadow too, and in a way it's kind of like the the cultural complexes of the society that kind of like reinforce at the same time the very much the collective shadow itself too. You know, a lot of these are very much unconscious, you know, and then they end up also at the same time distorting, you know, the archetypal energy that's there, because, you know, it creates a particular image based on the cultural beliefs that are there, you know, and that might not really connect to the archetype itself, but it still will have its effects, especially if one is unconscious of this. But, you know, the thing is, you know, regarding the situation that we're in, I don't know, sometimes regarding things, I don't know, what comes to mind to me actually is the eagle metaphor that Anastasios used. Sometimes the eagle needs to almost hit the ground before it goes back up again.
Yeah, I could pick up on that. So we sort of brought some ideas forth, and I'd like to hear what you have to say. So tying this to this Kraken idea, I'd say in like, because you said it correlates to instinct, and so we could even tie that back to Nietzsche's Dionysian and Jung's Wotan as they pertain to these conflicts and strife and war, and how these archetypal forces sort of explode forth when the culture is in such a condition. And this sort of makes me think, you know, these forces, why must they be so violent? And, you know, we could tie it to, I think, a Thanatoic drive, this death drive, in the sense that, you know, because Dionysus has some ties, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but he sort of has some, I know he's not the ruler of the underworld, but he has some ties to death. Is that right? Would you say?
In the more archaic sense, you know, with the Orphics too, and, you know, if you take it back way back to more like kind of like the archaic Greek and like more Mycenaean times.
Right. Okay.
He is indeed associated with the underworld.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And sometimes even conflated with Hades himself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's useful. And of course, Wotan has ties to war and conflict and strife. So we've got this complex of like confluence of ideas, wherein the instinctual, repressed shadow, cultural shadow, this collective shadow, this repressed instinctual, it then bursts forth. And so I'd like to tie this back to what I was saying, alluding to about how our overly Apollonian culture becomes too narcissistic, too individuated in the Nietzschean sense, and unwilling to let go in any sense of a ritual rebirth. We've sort of set up this mirror between the drives toward life and the Thanatoic drives, which are repressed, which you know, that are embodied in this death and rebirth ritual in a healthier sense, compared to the bursting forth of, whether you want to call it the Kraken or Dionysus or Wotan. So what are your thoughts on that?
When looking at the archetype, in that sense, I would say, you know, with Wotan, for instance, but also with Dionysus, it's kind of like the shadow unintegrated form of it. that's expressing itself. Because there is the integrated form of it. But then, with Wotan too, with Odin, like, he hung himself from the tree for 9 nights, and there's a lot of that kind of symbolism in there as well, with the whole death and rebirth. But the thing is, I don't know, it kind of like reminds me also about, it is kind of in this kind of that we're in that situation, kind of in that like Brothers Grimm horror movie where they meshed all, or like they put all these different elements of Brother Grimm movies together to create this like queen of mirrors that like sucks the life out of these young girls within that movie. It really, I guess, in that sense, requires one to break the mirror, to kind of like, for something to break the mirror in that sense, to really, I guess, break the spell of it all. But that's not an easy thing. And I think on a personal individual level, it really depends. It really depends on if that's going to happen for some or not. But I do think that some people can for sure help each other out with that, to try to do something to I guess ease the load regarding what's coming to some degree. But then again, at the same time, it's just generally difficult, the whole situation itself. I would not know what would be very helpful, but it's. But I also do think, though, that in that sense, that it's kind of like almost like a building up of like pressure. It's like the building up of a volcano in that sense, where the kind of, in that sense, the repressed instinct is just like building up, and then all the, in that sense, regarding the shadow, the projections, the sense of like unconsciousness regarding what's going on, and the rigidity of the persona can become like more and more and more, and there's then more and more internal tension, and with it also more and more external tension, and then it just builds up to a point where then that explosion occurs. But But yeah, I don't know what more to say regarding that, to be honest.
Well, I found that very interesting, and just to briefly tie back to this Odin Wotan symbol, if we sort of think of the chronology, like the more gestalt sense of the symbol, including the war aspects as well as the hanged man. In that single symbol, we can see the positive and negative aspects, the like the integration, the death and rebirth and seeing new perspectives, but also the de-evolution and barbarism of unintegrated instinct that then bursts volcanically forth. But also, what I found really interesting about something you sort of alluded to was this idea of perhaps something external that helps the individual in breaking this mirror and seeing beyond their own ego. And we could see that in the community, because you could see things about me that I might not see about myself, and vice versa. And so we can see how the community can be helpful in that. But also, what I'd like to put forward towards you would simply be this idea that is possibly something that's missing, that we are discovering through talking around these subjects. Could that something outside of the individual, something that we've lost, could that something be something like a sense of the sacred, or a connection to something divine, which is beyond the individual as well as beyond even the community?
In some sense, actually, I would say probably yes. It probably would play a big part regarding that. I mean, in both, like, it doesn't really matter in to that. It doesn't really matter in what particular way one would understand it, but like, yes, something that would put oneself in kind of a perspective where one is kind of like in relation to something bigger would be probably, yes, a thing which would be very much helpful to help with that. But then again, it does also boil down to the person coming to that kind of relationship on their own accord too, and to find that kind of relationship, maybe with nature, or some deity, or in whatever form that this may take place. But that itself also kind of boils down to some sense of what the for instance the Maenads and the Bacchic rites were connected to as well. In that sense, it's kind of this sense of dissolution that happens with it as well. Because and it kind of then boils down to some kind of Dionysian dissolution as well. Where the ego and the sense of self is all taken away and just falls apart in the whole. But the thing is that at the same time, I would say it's also about finding a balance regarding that as well, which is important, to balance these things out. But it surely would be one way how to approach it, yes. But then again, in the sense of spirituality, for instance, if we take it like that, it does, depend on how one approaches it.
Yeah, definitely, because we could think of examples culturally that are perhaps manifestations of this idea that we're talking about. So, for example, Jordan Peterson's sort of on this crusade to try and, he sort of specifically ties it to Christianity. He's described it himself as a rescuing of the father from the belly of the whale, which we could say in a general sense that is sort of true, trying to reintegrate this sense of the sacred into our secular society. Perhaps we could be critical in saying that Christianity might not be the way forward in the broad sense. I'm not trying to be disparaging, and if people find worth in that, I'd find that hard to argue against, although I think it's also fair to say that Christianity has sort of had its day, and it's only seems to be in a decline. But also, McGilchrist has his own relation to the sacred, which he talks about increasingly openly. But also, even in Nietzsche, we could say, well, he's tried to overcome this sense of the sacred, but what he's landed into is creating this idea of an Übermensch.
Yes.
Right? So we could, you could come up with 1,000 interpretations of what exactly that is supposed to mean. But, would it be so wrong to say that is his sense of the sacred? And even in, the Nazis had their own pseudo-religious ideology and ideologies in general. Marxism, in some degree, is an attempt to escape the Hegelian ties to the divine that was still left over. Any sort of ideologies that people pour themselves into in a pseudo-religious way. This is sort of a reaction to the whole left by the religious, the role the religious has played, and the perennial problem of dealing with the sacred. And like you talked about, this does connect to how Nietzsche describes this Dionysian, this letting go of the sense of self and periodic disillusions to, reconnect with this truest sense of reality, if you want to put it in such a way.
Yeah.
The question we are left with then in our majoritatively secular society is, what are we dissolving ourselves into? There's this skepticism and this phobicness toward anything sort of religious or sacred. Even to use the language of divinity or sacredness, there's almost like a collectively traumatic response people have toward it. And, people try and dance around these ideas by perhaps saying something along the lines of, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. This is an increasingly common idea.
Yeah.
This, like, dancing around, because we still have to deal with it. Like I said, it's a perennial problem. It's archetypal, this sacredness and this divineness. But we are sort of caught in this trap, in this flat ontology, wherein people are too afraid to give themselves in this Dionysian way to anything beyond themselves. Of course, this isn't true for everyone. Plenty of people do find their way. And to bring Jung into this, Jung talks about this spirit of the depths, which, and in the Red Book, he talks on and on about going your own way, like you've alluded to, about how we perhaps really do need this sense of the sacred, but we perhaps it's time to move on from this, this institutional form wherein it seems to always collapse into dogma and ideology.
Yeah.
So, like he says, going your own way. And in cultivating this relationship, to tie this back to the collapse of the two worlds mythology and the inability to return to the cyclical, eternal return reality, perhaps in this we could start to form a new relationship, a relationship to this spirit of the depths, a personal, sort of sacred relationship. And, Jung calls it the depths, in which you increasingly delve into a deeper and deeper relationship. You could call it that, or you could equally just invert it and call this, an increasing form of self-transcendence. The key being, in either case, we've sort of, saved the father from the belly of the whale, this idea of sacredness and divinity. But what we've left behind is this two worlds narrative sort of sense, wherein we have these Jungian depths, or this idea of transcendence, whichever way you want to think about it, this sacredness and this developing relationship, which is no doubt imbued deeply with meaningfulness. We've got this potentially without the need for the two worlds and the narrative. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
Want to when it comes to, I don't know, when it comes to these things though, what I can also say though is that I do kind of think that even though there might be short-term, there's might be individuals that are going their own way. In the end, there does always tend to be for some kind of, I guess, religion or something along the sorts to establish itself. That's one thing. Like looking at history, which seems to be a recurring pattern there. How it exactly would look like, who knows? Like, I would not. But then again, I also do think that that kind of like Jungian idea of going your own way could actually, in of itself, turn out to be to grow into its own kind of, I guess, religion of sorts. A very paradoxical one, but then again, a lot of this regarding going into the depths is at the same time, if you do that, connecting, to these different archetypes, and it's connecting to these ancient patterns, really, what they are. And with that, I do think, we end up at some point. I mean, it's kind of like going your own way, but I do think at some point, because you will hit at these these deeper shared layers that are there. There's going to be at some point a coming together again of that to this like shared layer of the collective unconscious, of the the collective psyche, because there's not really any way of like to truly get away from that. Like, yes, you can become conscious of it, and you can try to become more and more conscious of these different aspects, and also of the personal side of it as well. And there is for sure this personal side, but there's also this collective side to it as well. And in the end, I do think that with that, once people get more towards that collective side, which is very much generally a later development that tends to happen. Once one has worked through all this these personal things, that eventually there's probably gonna be a collective drive again towards some kind of religion of sorts. Even if it might not use that kind of terminology, it would still probably behave as such. But that would really be, in the sense of time span, looking at like, I don't know, hundreds of years, maybe like 500 something, like a long time. That's kind of what I anyways think regarding this. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, there's a lot you said I'd agree with, and I certainly think, we're definitely talking about long timelines here. I would just like to point out, whilst I'm borrowing the Jungian language of going your own way, whether I'm not trying to say this is what Jung meant, and it's certainly not what I mean, which is when I say going your own way, I'm definitely not trying to promote this idea of sort of a narcissistic, egoic path where you just collapse into yourself. This, we've been arguing against this throughout this entire talk in some capacity, I would say. So that's definitely not what I'm saying. Of course, this self-investigation is a huge part of it. But if you ever, completely disconnect yourself from the community, you're only asking for trouble. And, again, we're seeing this, there's always this battle between individuation and the community. To what degree are you giving up aspects of yourself to be part of the community? And to what degree is this a good idea? Do you want to be the hermit on the periphery, or do you want to be fully integrated into the society? And this is a perennial problem. We see trouble with things like declines in patriotism is a good example, because it's like, well, do you want to be proud of your country?
Yeah.
But to what degree does that become narcissistic, and it sort of, you develop an unhealthy relationship, and you lose wisdom from the outside. That's like a country example, but the exact same thing is at the play at the purely individual level. So someone who thinks they've got it all figured out and refuses to learn from others, that's just the exact same thing is embodied in a country that cuts itself off from any aid from others. And you see that in plenty of examples. So like today,
Yeah.
we have access to essentially any sort of produce at any time of the year, thanks to interconnections. And that's just one, seemingly small example. So perhaps from this, we could conclude that whatever this sense of the sacred or divinity is, in fact, wraps around the entirety of the individual and the community.
Mm.
This idea of going your own way, though it can easily sound like a solitary path, perhaps it's, anything but that. Because, of course, religious systems throughout history have always, for the most part, had some communal aspect, some ritual in which people are very much tied together. And like I said, I'm not trying to advocate for a return to any kind of religion, but perhaps we may not survive without this sense of the sacred in some capacity. And so we're trying to, reinvigorate that and investigate that and come to understand better exactly what it is we're missing, so that hopefully we may be able to integrate it and survive. So, like I said, whatever this sense of the sacred is, it perhaps necessarily has to encompass the entirety of the individual and the community, though it may appear at any given point along an individual's journey that the path toward the sacred and this developing of the spirit of the depths, at any given time, it may come across as a more solitary adventure. Perhaps at one time we do need to more so embody the spirit of the hermit, and then others we need to come back to the community, engage in that communal ritual, dissolve ourselves Dionysianally into the collective, and lose periodically that sense of self, and experience a greater totality of being.
But I do also think regarding that, like, yeah, there's for sure, like, that kind of like the tension that is there between the the person and the collective, and in that sense, and there's always has been. But at the same time, like, do feel like, the individuation in that sense is much like the hero's journey, and it is very much like yeah, there might be these moments and these times when you're going off alone, but then in the end, we're not solitary creatures, and in the end we're at least most people tend to come back. It's like it kind of reminds me of the Choreos tradition too. It's like there people would go off from their society, and a lot of them would come probably back, but then there's some that just don't, and they end up creating some new society on their own, like in the ancient sense. But similarly, I do feel there will always tend to be that sense of community that will form around something, but also that sense of community really that's needed with regarding to individuation itself as well, because Jung also pointed out that that it is kind of essential to have something along these lines. If you're completely alone, then and you're trying to do to individuate in that sense, it kind of can get very bad, because you're very much lacking that sense of grounding that one needs to kind of make it through successfully, because you can't be completely alone. Regarding that, there's always a need to find that balance, and in the end, when it comes to the self as well, in the sense of the Jungian self, there is also that balancing of the inner and the outer world too, that happens too. So it still remains important, I would feel, to that sense of coming back for at least most people. And I think it in that sense it will also form again. And I do think also that a lot of people are very much yearning towards something like that too, even if it's not in a religious sense.
Yeah, definitely. The eventual coming back for the grand majority of people is something I definitely agree with. Contra this egoic sense of individuation, like the imposition of the ego as a separate self. It always has to be nested in something, and particularly this is reflective of our time, wherein we are in this excessively Apollonian self, like we've talked about earlier, about how the single soul in the single home can just exist as if they are truly an isolated self, and the community becomes nothing but being surrounded by strangers. So could pick up here something McGilchrist says. We are three key relationships we are losing in modernity is a relationship to the community, like we've been talking about, a connection to nature, and a connection to the sacred. And so, there's little controversy that each of these would make up an aspect of the individuation process. And in all of these, we can see at any given time, there is a connection to something beyond the individual. So if, like I was talking about, this phase of embodying the hermit, perhaps, this links to this idea of nature. We need to connect to nature. And though it would appear that if someone's at the point of their journey wherein they're focusing on their connection to nature, it may appear as a solitary venture. In perhaps we could say a broader sense, there's nothing solitary about it, because the key thing going on is that connection and relationship to nature. And of course, then when reintegrating into the more communal, the relational aspect becomes more clear. because that is
Yep.
the common sense understanding of what a relationship is. And then, sort of like we've alluded to as well, this complete encapsulation of the sacred, whether it would appear a given individual is at a point in their journey where they is a solitary or an engagement in the more solitary or the more communal, there is always the connection to the sacred. And so, like I've tried to lay out in these three examples, always something that the self is connecting to, and in a way, whether it's community, nature, or this sacred in its most clear form, always something beyond the self. And this, you could call it the integrated Dionysian aspect, in this Nietzschean sense, wherein the sense of self is lost. Although talking in such a way, it's hard because, to what degree is the sense of self lost? And, perhaps we're moving into more Buddhist territories when speaking in such a
Kind
way.
of.
Yeah, because, it's hard to say, would someone who claims to have truly lost their sense of self, do they then lose the capacity to differentiate between themselves and another? I'd find that hard to believe. And so, how far do we want to take this metaphor of losing the self? And all I'm saying I'm not critiquing this notion. I'm just saying, perhaps I don't know all there is to know on the subject, and I say perhaps there's no doubt about that. But all I'm trying to say is, when we look at the relational aspects, the self is ever present, whilst also perhaps in the proper alignment, also connecting to something beyond itself. And so in that, we have this, it's sort of like we've come full circle to this integration of the Apollonian, wherein the individual, has a solid, confident, and embodied sense of self, whilst also knowing and connecting to the Dionysian, wherein everything and all that is beyond the self, whether it's embodied in nature, the community, or the sacred, that is also properly integrated at all times. And I say that at all times, I'm sort of laying that out in a goal sort of sense. This is the path of individuation, and this is the path wherein we have a developing and deepening and transcending sense of meaning, but there is no tie to a narrative like in the two worlds mythology, but there is also this continuous development which isn't found in the cyclical mythology, if that makes sense.
So how exactly are you then seeing that regarding this new or like kind of this form that's kind of neither this this older cyclical and then this dual form that we're kind of going out of, like how would that kind of look like then, to paint a picture for people?
Yeah, that is hard to say, because this is sort of, I've sort of argued my way to this point, and now I'm sort of like, well, what have I got to say? How can I tell people this is sort of what I think you should do, and now go and do it? That's sort of like, there is an absence there, right? Because it is tough, because these are developing ideas of my own, and that is fundamentally all they are, in a sense, because though this is the case I'm making, this sort of a new idea of developing and individuation, like I say, it's still new territory. We're very much in new territory because it's easy to sort of build your way away from these old modes of being that I've sort of, decided. I'd like to think on good evidence, these are no longer functional. These are nostalgic sort of returns to old ways of being. This isn't functional. And so we need something new. And so I'm looking in a lot of different areas like the Nietzschean, the Jungian, any sort of, and more broader psychological, the current developments and, trying to consider the wisdom of the past, integrating that and thinking about, not ignoring the current science and the current state of reality, trying to bring all that together and consider how we bring all that together. We can't no longer fall back on this two worlds, nor the cyclical. And so this is how I've landed on these notions of a non-narrative deepening connection with reality, and perhaps something along the lines of the sacred. And when I say it's not narrative, I mean that in the sort of a sense that we're not historically dependent, though of course we are connected and should be connected and should learn from the past. I'm sort of answering the critique of, this nihilistic notion of, well, in the end, it doesn't matter because we'll all be dead. That is, I think, it's sort of a parasitic tie that the narrative has to that, wherein, if there's some ultimate truth that humanity is moving towards because of our mortality, you may not get to see that. And so, you end up nihilistic. But equally, say, if you were immortal and you live forever, you then have the capacity to, learn every language, try every food, experience everything you can. Ultimately, we can't say this definitively, but for all intents and purposes, if you were immortal, you're going to reach a point of ultimate boredom. So what I'm trying to lay out here is at either end of the spectrum, mortality or immortality, when we're thinking in these narrative terms, whether it's an ultimate goal or an ultimate quenching of all that reality has to offer, in this narrative sense, there is, this inevitable collapse into nihilism at either end of the pole. So that's why I'm, trying to think in these terms, whether Jung calls it the spirit of the depths, wherein, we can't divorce ourselves from narrative entirely because we are living in time and, you can identify past from future.
Yes.
There is a narrative in a sense. But what I'm perhaps trying to get at is that is our sense of meaningfulness and the sense of the sacred in contact with reality, is it dependent on this narrative, Because, of course, every individual has their own goals. But do we need to think of these goals? Are these goals made irrelevant because of that nihilistic sort of continuum that I laid out, whether, the goals are rendered meaningless because they'll eventually be forgotten, but also if you completed every goal you ever had, then it also ends up being meaningless because it's like, well, what do you do now? And this connects to the, this idea of the endlessness of reality, because you could look at that and say, well, that's in a way nihilistic because, especially from an Enlightenment perspective and whatever degree that we still have Enlightenment values, which I'd say is very much the case in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because they're all about we need to just ask the right questions and solve all the problems, and then we'll live in utopia. But this is a failing perspective for reasons I've laid out.
Yes.
And also because, what reason do we actually have to assume that that is even a possible attainable goal? But then, like I've tried and started to lay out, this new idea of the sense of the sacred and depth and transcendence that isn't dependent on narrative, we can still have, through that mode of being, a meaningful existence. And, I'm sort of dancing around a lot of different angles and different points, and I'm failing to come to a final culmination. But that is part of the parcel,
Yeah.
I don't yet have a way to succinctly sort of, here's all of what I've argued for, and now just do these 5 things and you'll live a happy life. It's not that simple. And so, I suppose I've sort of just rattled off a lot of ideas. So, is there anything you'd like to say thus far?
Well, I was kind of just thinking, and in that sense, that similarly, like how something of a sort of like kind of like religion might form again. Similarly, something regarding a narrative would happen too. It's like the archetypes will start to embed themselves into such things. Their human creativity will create kind of new myths if need be. So there's that kind of that part too. But it depends on, I guess, also what one considers, or like, what does one see as narrative. But in a way, it is kind of a myth of itself too, the whole narrative, what the Enlightenment is as well. It's kind of its own, in a way, mythological framework.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Because it's sort of just, not that I want to reduce everything to dogmatism, but you can sort of see whether you consider any given ideology or framework secular or religious, this capacity to devolve into dogmatism is there for any kind of ideology and for religious institutions. So off the back of that, something I'd like to ask is, do you think possibly, because I do agree there's always the potential for new mythologies or new religions or new ideologies to form, but do you think possibly there could be this, like, an idea of a cultural collective trauma in which the collective sort of shies away from reproducing a sort of religion? Because you could sort of say we do see this to a degree in modernity with the increasing secularization of our society. There's this turning away of religion, in reaction to its failures. Could conceivably a similar sort of pattern happen for any kind of ideology? Because this is even true of the sciences. The scientific method,
yes,
Enlightenment values are coming under greater scrutiny.
I would say in the end, not a singular particular thing, that we think of in that regard will truly last forever in that way. In when it comes to these kind of ideas 'cause, it evolves. That's kind of just what it does. And yeah, that's also one thing that I've remembered now regarding Buddhism. In Buddhism, by the way, it's not about dissolving the ego, but it's about building a strong enough ego whilst being also connected to the greater whole at the same time as well. So it's kind of like an interplay between both. So in a way, it's kind of like a balancing of both the Apollonian and the Dionysian to experience both kind of at the same time, which is kind of the end, which is kind of the end goal of enlightenment itself. And it is often, within Western, some Western circles, this misconception that somehow it's like about, oh no, the ego bad, we need to get rid of the ego, which actually is not what it is about. But
yeah, definitely, I definitely agree that there is a lot of that confusion, and a mistranslation of Buddhist principles. There's plenty of argumentation as to exactly what that might mean, and even to what degree can a person dissolve their ego, and how can we share that, and what does it actually mean if someone completely dissolve their identity?
Well, in a way, and from also from a Jungian lens, though, what I do want to point out, it's like it's not really, I wouldn't say identity. It's like, well, it depends on what you tie yourself to. If you tie yourself to the ego, or cling to it in that sense, and it gets tied up to that, or the persona, then yes, I mean that's if that's your sense of self. But at the same time, there's also the from a Jungian lens, I guess the self, and I would say, really, there's also the what the Buddhists call the non-self, which the Hindus call the Atman, is still with both something to that still exists and is still there, and with that, I mean, sure, I mean, the ego, and in that sense, what that kind of sense of self is something that's kind of continuously evolving, and goes through these cycles of death and rebirth in that sense. But I don't know, there's also a deeper layer of who we are that does not get destroyed, or get lost, and it can't really be lost. That's that. Let's say the Jungian self, call it like that, which is the center of the personality. And speaking from experience, it's like I've had my moments of that, that kind of dissolution, these dissolution moments. But the thing is that even though they happen, there's always a coming back to that sense of self, because that sense of self that is or I guess the, let's say, the ego is something that is still needed, and is still something that is part of being able to function within the world. It's kind of the Dionysian and the Apollonian kind of need each other in that way to balance each other out, because if it just goes too far Dionysian all the way, then you end up just going it's like falling like a rock in the water, and you just in or like a, maybe better said, like an ice cube in the water, and it just goes into the water, and then it's gone, which is not a good thing. But then also on the other hand, like if you as a person in that sense become basically like a Greek marble statue, then that's also not a good thing. It's kind of about like finding that that interplay of both, really, which is also true with Buddhism.
Yeah, for sure. And even, we could take that ice cube metaphor and say, well, the ice cube may dissolve in the river, but has the ice cube truly disappeared?
In a way, no.
Yeah.
it all just matters from the sense of, I guess, perspective that one has.
Yeah, because there is a lot of confusion about this sense of self and ego and identity. Not to make it political, but in culture we see these competing ideas wherein a person's identity, whatever they self-proclaim it to be, is this ultimate unquestionable reality, and it must be respected with the utmost reverence. But also at the same time, this sense of identity is so nebulous that a person has ultimate authority of it and can decide whatever they want, regardless of whatever the environment may say differently.
I don't know. In that sense, I would really say, regarding that sense of identity, it's kind of at the same time, it's like there's the core that's not in that sense like kind of stable, but at the same time, there's also the changing aspect of it as well. So it's kind of both at the same time. Yeah, that's kind of what that, in my opinion, would really boil down to. It's kind of both are true at the same time. It's like, I don't know, it's one of these like Buddhist wisdoms that are like for what's the wisdom of Dharma too? I don't know. I'm not sure which one it is, but there's one of them that is basically like, that both it's the, was it the wisdom of equality, how to also called that samsara and nirvana are of one mode and of one taste. But then there's also the other wisdom, where there's a sense of discernment between the two, and in a way, both are true at the same time. It's both. Both realities kind of exist at the same time.
Yeah, I'd agree. There's plenty of paradox to be going around, and we, paradoxical as many ideas may be, that doesn't mean we get to shy away from them and just, cut them in half and pick whichever side you prefer the most.
Yeah, because and I kind of feel like that it's something like connected and very much to the the idea of the union self, but also to ideas like yin and yang as well. The yin yang, and with different aspects. Within different older pagan ideas as well, there's always this sense of duality there, where either some figure or concept, embodies, which is true with the union itself too, like this sense of two things at the same time, like it's hot and cold at the same time, or it's kind of something that's beyond duality, that I guess our human brains really can't wrap our heads around. But then again, I do also feel like, with a lot of these things, it doesn't really boil down to trying to wrap your head around, but also it really boils down to a sense of experiencing, and a sense of like, working towards such a state of being. And with it, regarding, the integration of both the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and these different aspects, it is through working through that, and through that sense of embodying, that this can this can actually manifest itself.
Right, 100%. And because, talking about this deeper reality, we could also think of it in a way as the relationship. So to take your example of hot and cold, it's only, these are comparative things, and we can only know either through relation to the other. So if hotness doesn't exist, there is also no coldness, because cold in comparison to what? But that sort of knowledge, in separating the two, though it is useful in instances, you can ask the question, what's more true, the hot or the cold? And the answer, of course, is neither. If there is an answer at all, it's what's most true is the relationship between the two, because that's the deeper reality. And so in that, it's exactly as you said. We know these things experientially and embodiedly, and through participation, participation with the hot and the cold, and thus coming to know the both, which is in reality the one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very much so. And I don't know if there's any particular things that you still have to that you have still on your mind regarding, something that you still want to say. Otherwise, I would like to, wrap it up. So, should go eat something.
I think this would be a great place to wrap it up. We've been going for a good long while now. I've definitely learned a lot, and this has been a useful experience for me to sort of consolidate and expand on some of my own ideas, and it's been infinitely interesting to listen to everything you've had to say. So in closing, I'd just like to then say
likewise.
Thank you.
Yes, likewise, thank you, and thank you for being here as well.
Yeah, it's been good to be here. Right, so with that said, I suppose I hope I'll see you. We'll be able to talk again at some point in the future.
Yes.
And I'll just, say goodbye, and we'll part ways for now.
Okay.
Right.
Likewise. Goodbye.
Bye. See ya.
See ya.